Hi, welcome to Cubs and Culture for January 24th, 2018. Excuse me. Today's going to be mostly about Dunkirk, that movie by Christopher Nolan about the Dunkirk evacuation and or retreat, however you want to phrase it. I didn't like this movie very much. So yeah. So before I begin that, I want to talk a little bit about the Oscars, because of course this film received several Oscar nominations, and I would basically strip all of them away from it. Okay, so for the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, this notion of, Oscar diversity, i.e. along gender and racial lines, Oscars so white, etc., whether or not the Oscars are diverse enough, especially once the Academy moved to its current system of nominating more than 5 films, depending. So, if you don't know how this works, at the Academy, everyone gets to pick 10 of their 10 films a year, which they consider the best film, or films they want to nominate for Best Picture. So in theory, but to be nominated, you need at least 5% of the Academy to vote for you. So most years you'll end up between, I believe it's 7 and 11, with 9 like being the often sweet spot. If you go back through the years, I like this system because I think it helps with everything. Because film as a medium is so, there's films which are primarily good because of the acting, and there's films that are good primarily because of the directing, and there's good films that are primarily good because of the story. And then it's somewhat specious or a little bit weird to try to compare a comedy to a drama, or how do you begin to intellectually begin to compare something like Get Out with Dunkirk, right? And I just think that having more more slots is good, because Oscar nominations can help people career. They're worth a lot of money, etc., etc., etc. And it's the thing I like about the Oscars is the celebration of film as a medium, and I would like for it to be more inclusive, not only demographically, but this is sort of the thing I want to talk about. Is I think there's a related problem with the Oscars in that if you look at the Best Picture winners, as sort of the example, is they're not really all that diverse in terms of genre or type of movies. So give me a sec. So most of the Oscar films fall into historical dramas, about historical dramas, or historical epics, and then you sort of have a side grouping of, and a lot of musicals falls into this, but sort of lighter entertainment that's about show business or theatrical, as in it's like the theater, and again, a lot of musicals fall into that sort of thing. And I actually think these two issues are related in that for a very, very long time, genres like horror or science fiction and fantasy were the way in which we talked about racial or gender identity issues. So, just to give some examples about this, one of the most overtly feminist films I have ever seen, of course, is the original Stepford Wife, not the Abomination with Nicole Kidman and Matthew Broderick from a few years ago. I'm talking the one from the 1970s, which is actually a really good movie. Or one of the very earliest LGBT films I've ever seen, in terms of its production, was Bride of Frankenstein, where there's this colossal in-joke with Dr. Pretorius basically being in love with Henry Frankenstein. Which was moreover in the original script, but they had to remove it because the censors caught that one. There's also this another sort of early LGBT film is this great movie called Dracula's Daughter, which is totally about a Victorian woman being a lesbian and being unable to express that, with vampirism being the metaphor. So because of this, that a lot of times in the way back in the day, the ways in which we talked about diversity or identity identity politics, and I mean that in a positive sense, was always through science fiction and fantasy films, and those or horror films, and those films are, or even those sometimes like comedies, like I know I've mentioned this film before, but like something like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, it was nominated for a couple of Oscars. It was not nominated for Best Picture, because it was a comedy, and comedies are also sort of systematically devalued. So because of the way in which the Academy sort of, I don't know, like maybe it's a self-reinforcing cycle that the Academy for a long time tended to value whiter, maler films, and those films tended to be much more about historical period dramas, or and so that's why the racial demographics are the way they are, or they tended to value historical dramas because of their artistic taste being that, so that's why the demographics are so white. Like I don't know what's the cart and what's the horse here. So let me just give some numbers. As far as I'm very briefly thinking about it, I didn't fully check, but in my knowledge, and I've seen all the Best Picture. Well, I've seen virtually all the Oscar nominations throughout the years. For genre, you have in the horror or thriller genre, you have one film from 1940 called Rebecca, which is an Alfred Hitchcock film. It's far more of a thriller than horror. Then for science fiction and fantasy, you have, so for fantasy you have one, and that's not debatable, that's Lord of the Rings. And then for science fiction, you might have Around the World in 80 Days from 1958, I think, 57, something like that. But that's not like so Around the World in 80 Days, the book is clearly science fiction because it's all about the technology and the time, and when it was written, it was about promoting science. But the movie itself is actually much more of like a broad travelogue comedy. So like, I don't know. So let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. So that's three films in horror and science fiction and fantasy of like 90. Okay. Meanwhile, and sort of my big bugaboo in terms of just how not diverse films are at the Oscars. If you look at World War II Oscars, like films that have won the Best Picture, which in some way touch upon World War II. From memory, I have The English Patient, Mrs. Miniver, The Best Times of Our Lives, Casablanca, The King's Speech, Schindler's List. So that's 6, which is almost 10%, and that's not all the historical dramas, because you can also do like Out in Africa and what's another one? I'm drawing a blank at the moment. Amadeus. It's etc. Okay. So excuse me. So it's not just so like for like there's more. There's also Patton, which I don't know if I said. So there's more films that tangentially connect to World War II than either horror and fantasy combined, and that's not okay. And so like I'll get into this a little bit more specifically with Dunkirk, but honestly, I don't think one of the reasons why I dislike this movie as much as I do is I don't like. There's nothing really fundamentally interesting about it. And not to tip my hand too much for the next section, but Mrs. Miniver and Atonement also deal with the Dunkirk evacuation, and everything you get from Dunkirk you can get from those two films, and vice sort of versa. And so like now some of this is a little bit unavoidable because of course like Mrs. Miniver and Casablanca and The Best Times of Our Lives were released during World War II, and obviously as a world war, a lot of films would have been made about it. But here's the thing. Let me just use 1998. There's been so many films about World War II that have been made, and sort of the Academy's taste for historical dramas or period pieces, that in 98, the 5 films nominated could each of them could be described as a World War II movie or an Elizabethan period piece, because the movies were Saving Private Ryan, The Thin Red Line, Life is Beautiful, all World War II movies, and then you had Elizabeth and Shakespeare in Love. Like, that sort of, so not only are the Oscar films tend to be very, very white, they also tend to be very, very narrow in their content. And so I would be perfectly okay if there was an unofficial or even an official that said, for the next 25 years, World War II movies are not eligible for Oscars. There's been too many of them, and like Dunkirk is like kind of like, why is we talking about this movie? It's just nothing new. Okay, I'll be back in a moment with more specific information. Okay, Cubs and Culture out.